you've got to talk to them and get them to relax and feel that you're genuinely interested in what they've got to say, so that they feel that you're not just there trying to get pictures, you know, which we're not, because we're just interested in people as well. There's our horse. An old building. That's a house for the horses.
Casa pentru cai, tanti.
Da, ai văzut?
Yeah.
Oh my God, it's very beautiful.
And I think unless you've got that empathy with the people, you're not going to get the photographs anyway. We don't use any lighting whatsoever. It's all natural light, whatever we can get through the windows or whatever. It can be very difficult, challenging at times because of the ISOs and things, but you know, we do our best. And
as soon as you walk in the door, you go on manual, whack the ISO up, take the shutter speed down, and hope you're not too shaky.
Yeah.
So to a layman, explain to me what you've just said. I mean, what's the process?
Okay, so the process is that we open up the
aperture
camera,
as
the
wide
aperture
as
of the
possible,
camera to get
get
as
as
much
much light
light in
in
as
as possible.
possible. We make the sensor as sensitive as possible to light by putting the ISO up, and we slow down the shutter speed so that the camera has
a
more
longer
chance,
exposure.
more chance to get the light in.
But you
So
could,
why don't you just use lights?
Because it would be too intrusive, and because it wouldn't represent the atmosphere of the place.
natural light is so wonderful to photograph with. And also, some of these places haven't got electricity anyway, you know, so you're on a bit of a loser to start. And the ones with the artificial lights, you can tell they're artificial lights. They've left a light on, and we normally try and switch the light off if they don't mind, you know.
It becomes a bit of a game, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because somebody goes and switches the light off, and then the subject goes
They
and
want to do
switches
some
it back
cooking,
on
so they
again.
switch it back on again.
And then someone surreptitiously switches it off again. But
Yeah.
I think we have to try and be as inconspicuous as possible. And I think introducing lights would make them a bit like rabbits in the headlight. You know,
Yeah.
I don't think they would
they-
take to that very well.
If you see the pictures in the house that are taken previously, when they sort of from the communist era and whatever, the older people, they just stand bolt upright and stare
Yeah.
straight at the camera, you know, featureless. You know, you get no emotion whatsoever. You know, so you've got to try and get around that, because that's their natural instinct, is to just go
Yeah.
rigid, you know, and you get nothing. So you just need to get them to relax in your company, and then you can start, you know, we quite often don't start the photography straight away. We give it 10 minutes just to get them to relax a little bit, then you start taking a few pictures.
Acolo ne-au dus, că ne-au dus numai la munci. Nu m-au dus,
Then you've got the issue that the person is probably talking to the guide, because that's the person talking Romanian, so they're not looking at you.
Ai vrea să schimbi ceva la viața mea ta?
Am ce să schimb. Îți vine așa. Grâiele astea soluționate.
Da.
Toate bunătățile le soluționează.
Also, you don't necessarily want pictures of them talking, or laughing necessarily, or just doing something out of character. So quite often the moment we look for is the moment when that part of the conversation is finished and they're thinking. And their face relaxes a bit as they think about what's
Yeah, and you can see that
expressed.
they're sort of in their own little world a little bit, not really focusing on very much, and then you get that nice expression on their faces and things, you know. So it's, and sometimes you get that expression because they're telling you something quite sad, you know, and then their face drops completely.
Mai e unul care îl face o dată, dar eu aș face pe
She's
la
talking
două.
about
e
not
mai
having
puternic, mai
any
bun.
children copying.
Îl faci o dată într-o zi și îl mai faci peste...
But then it's quite difficult sometimes when somebody's got a tear rolling down their face not to be sort of empathetic and thinking, I really ought to get this shot, you know, and sometimes that can feel a bit awkward.
The last person we photographed, this really gifted man who could play the saxophone, the flute. He was a shepherd, he was a carpenter. He had his own sort of almost market garden in his back garden. The guide said to me that I should talk directly to him in English and look him in the eye, and then he would translate it for me, and that way we would get a better connection. And that was quite a moving situation, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And then about 20 minutes later, he produced this flute he wanted to give me.
But you were the one shedding the tear, weren't you?
Yeah, I was actually. Yeah, I was, because of his story, really.
Yeah.
And I'd gone out there in the summer, having gained this bursary from the RPS and The Guardian, to write a photo essay on the changes in values between 3 generations of women. And on the first trip, we discussed the fact that maybe one of the parts of the story should be a missing woman, where there was no woman. And actually we found that in this last character that we photographed on our last trip, because he couldn't find a woman. They'd all left to work in Western Europe. There was nobody left in the village for him, and despite the fact that he was a fit, healthy, gifted chap.
And intelligent, he spoke Russian
Very
and French.
intelligent. There was no opportunity for him to find a wife and raise a family.
So why didn't he leave and go to the city?
I think he was quite well rooted in the tradition, because he came from a family of shepherds and flute players. And he had carried on that tradition, and also he had his carpentry, and he lived in the most stunning location.
Yeah, up on the mountain.
And
I think he just loved it there, you know.
Yeah.
And he got no transport, so you know he couldn't drive to work, and he was miles from anywhere to be able to walk.
Going back to that issue about having to do everything through a guide, I mean, if somebody does start to shed a tear, you only find out 3 or 4 minutes later why that's happening, don't you?
Yeah,
Yeah.
we do, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's very
yeah.
difficult to know whether to back off at that point.
It is
You don't know what
difficult,
to say.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, quite often then we'll instead of stood there with the camera taking a photograph, sometimes just go onto your back screen and, you know, get a focus on the back screen and just quietly press the button while you're staring, looking and taking it all in, and just sort of surreptitiously taking a few photographs, you know. But, you know,
it was awkward
you try-
photographing a funeral, wasn't it?
It
We
was,
photographed a COVID funeral because the funeral was held really quickly, and although some of the children flew in from Europe, Western Europe, there were still people that couldn't attend. So they said they'd be quite grateful for some shots.
some shots and some video of the funeral for relations.
Our guide said to us, look, don't be alarmed. It's quite normal to cry a lot and show a lot of emotion at these events. It's a normal custom. But it was quite tough, wasn't it?
It was tough, yeah, because they don't hide their emotions at all, and they really sort of get very upset, you know, and it's quite difficult to
And this whole
photograph.
COVID thing was tough, wasn't it?
was
Because
tough,
this
yeah.
time, this last trip, COVID seemed to be stalking these valleys, and lack of public education and listening to the anti-vaccine propaganda meant that the vaccine uptake was only about 30%. And in this case, the funeral that we went to was a family that we follow in Maramureş, and we know them quite well, and we went round to see this woman, and she was in tears, and she said, my mother's just died of COVID. And in fact, we'd seen the ambulance arrive the previous day without realising it. It was the first time I'd seen a sort of COVID ambulance situation with people all in white suits and an empty ambulance. This was at night. And apparently her mother had had oxygen for 2 hours and then died at the age of 71, I think.
Yeah.
So, and then we just kept seeing funerals.
So when you come away, do you think, oh God, I hope the 21st century catches up with them for their sake? Or do you think, I hope they stay...
That's a very,
that's a
very
very
difficult
good
question. Yeah, it is a
I mean,
difficult question.
it would be great. It would be great if they could be supported to live a better life where they are. You know, they have to go where the work is, and that's Western Europe. But there's a huge amount of potential there, and it wouldn't cost a fortune to do that.
I mean, it's the older people that can't go abroad and work that are really suffering, because they are just left to their own devices, you know, and that is really tough for them.
It is almost unbelievable that they live in that state in the European Union. So what they really want and what I would like for them is some employment, some concerted effort to generate some sort of economy in that area.
The trouble is, tourism, I think, would spoil it.
So the answer to that question, should they be brought into the 21st century or left in blissful isolation?
Well, they do need to be brought into the 21st century, but in a way that respects their traditions, if that's possible.